It was Christmas Eve, and all I wanted was to stay home. The snow had started falling just after noon, a slow and lazy drift that quickly turned aggressive. By the time the sun dipped behind the clouds, it was a full-blown blizzard. I stood by the front door, tugging on my gloves, watching as Cal, my strapping tall husband, shoveled the driveway for the third time that day. His parka was already covered in fresh snow, and his breath curled in the frigid air. "Noelle, you don't have to go in, you know," he called over his shoulder, pausing to lean on the shovel. "I'm sure they'd understand." I smiled, shaking my head as I wrapped my scarf around my neck, pulling my long hair to the side. "It's Christmas Eve, Cal. They're already short-staffed. Besides, who's going to cover for me? Santa?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he sighed, brushing snow off his hat as he trudged back toward the porch. His boots crunched loudly against the ice. "I just wish we could stay in, drink some eggnog, watch It's a Wonderful Life." "And argue about whether it's overrated?" I teased. "It's a classic," he shot back, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "You love it." "I tolerate it," I corrected. The smile faded as he stepped closer. "I get it, though. Duty calls." He reached out, adjusting my scarf. "I just wish they didn't have to call you in tonight. I don't like the idea of my wife out there in this awful mess." "I know," I said softly. And I did know. There was nothing I wanted more than to be home with him, curled up on the couch while the storm raged outside. But life didn't work like that, not when you were a nurse. People needed help, especially on nights like this. He nodded, letting it go the way he always did. That was one of the things I loved about Cal. He never fought me when it came to my job, even when I knew he wanted to. "Take the truck," he said, jerking his thumb toward the Sierra parked at the end of the driveway. "The Subaru won't make it 2 blocks in this mess." "Cal, I'll be fine." "No." His voice was firm, almost parental. "You're taking the Sierra. End of discussion." I rolled my eyes but didn't argue. The truth was, I wasn't eager to test the Subaru's limits either. I grabbed the keys from the hook by the door, zipping up my coat as I stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately, biting at my cheeks and stinging my eyes. Cal followed me down the porch steps, his shovel resting on his shoulder. "Drive slow, okay? And call me when you get there." "I will." "I mean it, Noelle. No shortcuts." I turned to face him, my boots crunching in the snow. "You sound like my dad." "Your dad's a smart man," he said with a grin. Then his face softened. "Merry Christmas, babe." "Merry Christmas," I said, though it didn't feel much like one. I climbed into the Sierra, the cold leather seat sending a shiver through me. As the engine roared to life, I saw Cal standing in the driveway, shovel in hand, waving me off. The roads were worse than I'd expected. The Sierra handled the snow with ease, but visibility was practically non-existent. I had to rely on muscle memory to guide me, the snow swallowing the familiar landmarks that usually marked my way to the hospital. The truck's heater was on full blast, but my fingers still ached from gripping the wheel too tightly. Every gust of wind felt like a slap against the windshield, the snow falling so thick and fast it was hypnotic. The hospital lights came into view just as my nerves were about to give out. I pulled into the nearly empty lot, letting out a shaky breath as I killed the engine. For a moment I sat there, listening to the wind batter the truck, trying to steel myself for the shift ahead. "Noelle, you've got this," I told myself. I opened the door and stepped out into the storm, the snow swallowing my boots as I trudged toward the ER. The wind howled, tugging at my scarf and hat, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached the automatic doors, I was half frozen, my coat crusted with snow. When I stepped inside, the warmth hit me like a wave. I brushed the snow off my sleeves, letting out a relieved sigh as the doors slid shut behind me. The ER was quiet. Too quiet. Kim and Rhonda were at the nurses' station, chatting over cups of coffee. The Christmas decorations felt out of place, garish against the stark hospital walls. A fake tree stood in the corner, its lights blinking weakly. "Merry Christmas Eve," Kim said, pushing her elf hat back into place. "Yeah, real festive," I replied, hanging my coat on the rack. Rhonda shook her head, her expression almost comically baffled. 30 years here, and I've never seen it this dead. Not on Christmas Eve." "Let's hope it stays that way," Kim said, but the way she crossed her fingers made me uneasy. I settled in at the nurse's station, glad to be inside, while gazing out the window as the snow whipped violently against the glass. The storm felt alive, angry even, and despite the warmth of the ER, I couldn't shake the chill that settled deep in my bones. The hours ticked by, the Christmas music on the overhead speakers barely masking the oppressive silence. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a living thing. And then the automatic doors hissed open. At first, I didn't see him through the flurry of snow gusting in behind him. It was only when he stepped forward, letting the doors close behind him, that I got a good look. The man was short, maybe 5'6", with a stocky build that made him seem rounder than he probably was. His light winter coat strained slightly around his middle, and his trapper hat was pushed back on his head, exposing a layer of sweat on his ruddy face. His breath came in shallow, quick puffs, and his small, darting eyes kept flicking back toward the doors, as though he expected someone, or something, to follow him inside. "Help," he said, his voice breathless and hoarse. I need to see a doctor." Kim glanced at me, raising an eyebrow, and I stood, grabbing the clipboard from the counter. "Sir, what seems to be the problem?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, though something about his panicked energy made my nerves twitch. He shuffled closer to the desk, clutching his chest. I can't breathe. Chest pain. Please." His eyes darted to the doors again, and I couldn't help but follow his gaze. The snow outside battered the glass in thick, angry clumps, but there was nothing else there, just the endless white of the blizzard. "Okay, sir, let's get you checked in," I said, slipping into professional mode. "What's your name?" "Paul," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Paul Fletcher." Kim took over the paperwork while I stepped around the desk to guide him to one of the exam rooms. His movements were jerky, like every step was a conscious effort, and his breathing was shallow and erratic. "Go ahead and have a seat," I said, motioning to the exam table. Paul climbed up awkwardly, his short legs swinging slightly as he settled. I worked quickly, snapping on gloves and wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm. His pulse was elevated, and his blood pressure was higher than it should have been. "Any pre-existing conditions? History of heart problems?" He shook his head, his face flushed and damp with sweat. "No, nothing like that. I don't know what's wrong, it just started." "When did the symptoms begin?" His gaze dropped to the floor, and he swallowed hard. "A couple of hours ago." Then, softer. "It got worse when I got here." That struck me as odd, but I kept my tone neutral. "Are you on any medications?" "No." I wrote down his answers, my pen moving automatically, even as unease crept up my spine. Something about his jittery, almost skittish demeanor made my stomach tighten. "The doctor will need to check you over to be sure, but we'll get you feeling better soon," I said, trying to sound reassuring. Paul's head snapped up, his eyes wide and desperate. "Will I be staying overnight?" "That depends on what the doctor says." Dr. Daly arrived a few minutes later, his usual unflappable demeanor intact. I stepped aside, leaving him to his work, and returned to the nurse's station where Kim and Rhonda were waiting. "Chest pains?" Kim asked, tilting her elf hat back. "Probably stress or anxiety," I said, though the words felt hollow. Paul's behavior didn't feel like a simple case of anxiety, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. 45 minutes later, Dr. Daly emerged, shaking his head. "Vitals are fine. EKG's normal," he said, keeping his voice low. "It's likely anxiety. Nothing to keep him overnight for." I nodded and grabbed the discharge forms. Anxiety. It made sense, but it didn't ease the gnawing feeling in my gut. When I returned to the exam room, Paul was hunched over on the edge of the table, his hands gripping his knees. He looked up as I handed him the paperwork, his round face flushed and glistening with sweat. "I'm not staying?" he asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "I'm sorry, but there's no need to admit you," I said gently. "Your tests came back normal." He stared at the papers in my hands for a moment before taking them. His fingers trembled as he scrawled his signature, his movements stiff and reluctant. I can't go out there," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the floor. I paused. "Why not?" He didn't answer right away, just shook his head. "You wouldn't understand." The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Something about his tone, the flat, resigned way he said it, made my skin crawl. "You can stay in the waiting room for a little while if you need," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But only for a little while." Paul nodded stiffly and shuffled toward the waiting area. He sank into one of the chairs near the corner, pulling his coat tighter around him. When I returned to the nurses' station, Kim and Rhonda were staring at me like I'd just suggested setting the hospital on fire. "What's wrong?" I asked. "You let him stay?" Rhonda said, her eyes narrowing. "If anything happens, that's on you." I waved her off, pretending her words didn't bother me. But as I glanced back at Paul, sitting hunched and motionless in the corner, the feeling in my gut grew heavier. The storm howled louder, and the windows shuddered under the weight of the wind. Paul didn't move. His small, stocky frame hunched in on itself like he was trying to make himself disappear. I couldn't help but wonder what, or who, he was hiding from. The storm howled louder, and the windows shuddered under the weight of the wind. Paul didn't move. His small, stocky frame hunched in on itself like he was trying to fold into the chair and disappear entirely. His hands gripped the edge of the seat so tightly that his knuckles were bone white, and his face glistened with a fresh sheen of sweat. From the nurses' station, I could just barely see him through the security door's narrow window, his outline framed by the red emergency lights. He hadn't moved since we let him stay, but his eyes hadn't left the double doors to the outside, as though he were waiting for something, or hiding from something. "What is his deal?" Kim muttered, breaking the tense silence. She leaned over the counter, peering through the window into the lobby. "He hasn't budged, just sitting there staring." "I don't know," I said softly, still watching him. Rhonda snorted, her arms crossed over her chest. "I told you it was a bad idea letting him stay. This is how it starts in all the horror movies, you know. Someone tries to be nice, and the next thing you know, boom, psycho on the loose." "Real helpful, Rhonda," I muttered. She rolled her eyes. "Just saying. I've been around long enough to know when something feels off. And he feels off." I turned my attention back to Paul. He hadn't moved an inch. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, his eyes flicking to the doors and then quickly away, as if he couldn't bear to look for too long. And then, faintly, there was a noise. It started as a low vibration, like the hum of a truck engine idling outside. But it grew louder, deeper, until the very walls seemed to tremble. "What the hell was that?" Kim asked, straightening up. Before I could answer, there was a deafening boom. It reverberated through the building, shaking the floors and rattling the security doors. A garland of tinsel fell from its perch near the window, and the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. We were plunged into darkness. For a long, terrible moment, the only sound was the distant scream of the wind battering the building. Then, with a mechanical groan, the backup generator kicked in. The red emergency lights flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Kim grabbed my arm. "What the hell is going on?" I didn't answer. My stomach was in knots, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then, from the lobby, came a sound that made my blood run cold. It was Paul. "No," he whimpered, his voice trembling. "No, no, no. It found me. It found me." I spun toward the hallway, my pulse racing. Through the small window in the security door, I could just make out Paul's shape in the red light. He was no longer slumped in his chair. He was standing now, his short frame trembling, his arms outstretched as if trying to ward something off. "Paul?" I called. He didn't answer. Instead, he backed up against the wall, his hands pressed to his head. "No, no, no," he moaned, his voice rising in pitch. "It's here. It's here." Kim was already moving toward the security doors, her hand hovering over the control panel. "I'll check on him." "Wait," I said, grabbing her arm. My gaze flicked to the window, to the ER doors on the far side of the lobby. Beyond the glass, the storm raged on, the snow swirling so thickly that it looked like a solid wall of white. But something moved. It was quick, just a flicker of motion in the snow. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow, tall and thin, gliding past the doors. My stomach twisted. "What are you looking at?" Kim asked, her voice low. "Something's out there," I whispered. "What?" "Something. Someone," I said, unsure if I even believed my own words. Another sound from the lobby pulled my attention back to Paul. He had dropped to his knees now, his head buried in his hands as he rocked back and forth. "It's going to get me," he muttered, over and over. "It's going to get me." Kim didn't wait for me to make a decision. She punched in the code, and the security doors hissed open. "Paul," she called, stepping into the lobby. I followed close behind, the icy air seeping in from somewhere. Paul didn't look up as we approached. He was trembling violently now, sweat pouring down his face. "Paul, what's going on?" Kim asked, kneeling beside him. "It's here," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "It's here. It's watching." I turned toward the ER doors, my stomach churning. The red emergency lights cast long shadows across the room, painting everything in an unsettling glow. Beyond the glass, the storm continued its relentless assault. And then, I saw it. A face, pressed against the glass. It wasn't human. Its pale, slick skin clung unnaturally to sharp, angular bones. Its eyes glowed a deep, malevolent red, staring with unbridled hatred. A twisted snarl revealed jagged, sharp, yellowed teeth, its breath fogging the glass in erratic bursts. I froze, my entire body locking up in terror. "Noelle?" Kim's voice sounded far away. The face disappeared. Paul let out a blood-curdling scream, clutching his stomach as he doubled over and began vomiting violently. Kim grabbed his shoulders, trying to steady him. "Paul, look at me. What's happening?" "It's going to get me," he wailed, his voice raw. "It's going to get me." I wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't. My eyes stayed glued to the glass, searching for any sign of movement, of that face. But the storm outside was still, eerily so. "It's going to get me. It's going to get me." I could feel the cold air creep through the lobby. It wasn't the kind of chill that came from the storm outside. This was something else. Something that crawled over your skin and sank into your bones. Kim leaned closer to Paul, her voice steady but firm. "Paul, look at me. What's going to get you? What are you talking about?" He didn't respond, just rocked slightly in the chair, his breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Rhonda appeared with a towel and a bottle of water, her normally unshakable demeanor showing cracks. "Here, let's clean him up," she muttered, dabbing at Paul's sweat-drenched face with the towel. "He's scaring the hell out of me, though." I couldn't disagree. Something about his frantic muttering and the sheer terror in his eyes made me feel like we were already in the middle of something far worse than we realized. Once Paul was cleaned up and sitting back in his chair, I headed back to the nurse's station to page Dr. Daly. We needed a second opinion, someone to decide if Paul should be admitted or sedated. But when I picked up the desk phone, there was no dial tone. I pressed the buttons, cycling through the internal system, but the line was completely dead. "That's weird," I muttered, grabbing my cell phone. No service. The bars were gone, replaced with the same taunting words I'd been seeing all night. No signal. I walked back to Kim and Rhonda, who were still hovering near Paul. "Phones are out," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Even my cell doesn't have service." Kim frowned, pulling her own phone out of her pocket. She held it up and waved it around, as though that would change the outcome. "Nothing here either." Rhonda checked hers, then set it down with a sigh. "This is bad. No phones, no way to contact anyone. And with this storm, we're completely cut off." The weight of her words settled over us, the silence in the ER growing heavier. Outside, the storm's howl seemed to intensify, and the wind began throwing clumps of snow and ice against the windows with loud, erratic thuds. Kim straightened up, brushing herself off. "I'm going to find Dr. Daly," she said, heading toward the security doors. "He's probably holed up somewhere else in the hospital." As she disappeared through the doors, I returned to the nurse's station with Rhonda, staring blankly at the black screen of the landline. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. That was when the ER doors hissed open. I froze, my hand hovering over the desk. The automatic doors slid apart smoothly, revealing a woman who stepped inside with a slow, deliberate calm. She was tall and impossibly thin, her gaunt frame draped in a long coat that looked like it had come out of an old black and white photograph. A felt wool hat sat perfectly on her blonde hair, which fell just past her shoulders in neat waves. Her trousers were made of thick flannel material, and she wore a scarf around her face, though it wasn't enough to obscure the unnerving sharpness of her features. She was completely dry. No snow on her coat, no ice clinging to her hat. Not a single flake stuck to her scarf or shoes. She walked with an eerie grace, her footsteps completely silent as she crossed the lobby. She didn't acknowledge me or Rhonda, didn't even look at us. Instead, she moved to a chair on the far side of the room and sat down, directly parallel to Paul. I glanced at Paul. His muttering had stopped abruptly, his head snapping up to look at the woman. His face went blank, his terror morphing into a frozen stillness. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Rhonda called out hesitantly, "Ma'am, can we help you with something?" The woman turned her head slowly, her movements unnervingly smooth. Her eyes locked onto Rhonda's, and I heard Rhonda suck in a sharp breath. The woman's eyes were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The sclera was the expected white, but her irises were pure black, with tiny, glimmering lights in their centers, like distant stars twinkling in the night sky. "No," the woman said in a soft, lilting voice. "I'm just waiting for this dreadful storm to die down." Her tone was polite, even pleasant, but the words sent a shiver down my spine. Rhonda nodded stiffly, retreating toward the rear of the nurse's station. Her face had gone pale, and she avoided meeting my eyes. The woman was still staring at Paul, and smiling. I tried to ignore the situation, and started sorting some charts from the day before. After a while, I turned and peered through the window into the lobby. That same feeling of helpless dread returned. Paul hadn't moved. He was hunched in his chair, his head down, his arms folded over his head as though he were bracing for a blow. And the woman, she was still staring, that small, unreadable smile fixed on her face. Kim returned a few minutes later, her expression grim. "The doors between the ER and the rest of the hospital are locked, electronically. I can't override them." "What?" I asked, my stomach dropping. "It's probably tied to the emergency power," she said. "But until the main power comes back on, we're stuck." Rhonda walked back over and let out a bitter laugh. "Of course we are. I wanted to call Cal. I wanted to hear his voice, hear him tell me everything was going to be okay. But my phone was still dead, and the storm outside showed no signs of stopping. When I looked back into the lobby, my heart lurched. The woman had moved. She was now sitting in the middle of the room, closer to Paul, her dark eyes still fixed on him. "How did she..." I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Kim followed my gaze. What the hell? I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I'm going out there, I said. Kim grabbed my arm. Noelle, don't. I have to. She let go reluctantly, and I stepped out from behind the security doors. The woman was now sitting directly across from Paul, smiling that same unnerving smile. Paul whimpered softly, curled in on himself like a child hiding from a nightmare. I stepped between them, planting myself in front of the woman. Can I help you? Her smile didn't falter. She stood slowly, her movements impossibly fluid, and leaned in close. Too close. Her breath was foul, a mix of sulfur and rot that made my stomach churn. Her skin, up close, looked unnatural, almost plastic. Believe me, there is nothing you can help me with, she said again, her voice a honeyed mixture of sweetness and menace. Her black, star-pierced eyes bore into mine, unblinking. I took a step back, swallowing hard, willing myself to stay calm. My heart was thundering so loudly I wondered if she could hear it. Then I'm going to have to ask you to leave, I said, forcing as much authority into my voice as I could muster. This isn't a public hangout. The woman tilted her head slightly, her smile never faltering. She didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, but the air around her felt colder, heavier. You're no longer welcome here, I said again, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. For a moment she just stared at me, her smile slowly widening, revealing teeth that were jagged, yellowed, and cracked. Then, without a word, she turned and began walking toward the ER doors, her movements smooth and deliberate, as if she were gliding rather than stepping. I watched her go, my pulse pounding in my ears. When she reached the threshold, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the glass. Paul let out a choked sob behind me, and I turned to see him looking up at me with tear-streaked eyes. He mouthed the words, "Thank you," his lips trembling. I nodded, unable to find my voice. When I looked back, the woman was gone, swallowed by the storm. The heavy doors hissed closed, and for a moment, the lobby was eerily quiet, save for Paul's quiet whimpers. I turned and walked back toward the security doors, my legs feeling like lead. The moment I stepped back into the nurse's station, I collapsed into my chair, letting out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. What the hell was that? Kim asked, her voice tight with barely contained panic. I don't know, I admitted. But she's gone now. Rhonda crossed her arms, shaking her head. I don't like this, Noelle. None of it. I couldn't argue. The air still felt heavy, oppressive, as though the woman had left something behind. Will someone come with me to the break room? Kim asked, her voice tight, barely masking the unease in her tone. I really don't want to go alone, she admitted, her eyes darting towards the lobby. I'll go with you, Rhonda said quickly, almost too quickly, as if to reassure herself as much as Kim. Together they disappeared into the dimly lit hallway, their footsteps fading into the silence, leaving me alone to face the growing sense of dread that lingered in the air. I glanced at my phone, desperate for some distraction, some sense of normalcy. But it was the same as before. No signal. I set the phone down and closed my eyes, willing my heart rate to slow. When I opened them again, I nearly screamed. The woman was there, leaning over the counter. Her face was inches from mine, her black eyes glittering with cruel amusement. You haven't told Cal about the baby yet, she said, her voice a sickly sweet mockery of concern. What are you waiting for? New blood can be so precious. My breath caught in my throat, and I fell backwards out of my chair. I quickly scrambled to my feet in time to see the woman had covered the 30 feet between the counter and the ER doors in the blink of an eye. The ER doors opened, and she vanished into the storm. Noelle! Kim rushed to my side, grabbing my arm. What happened? What's wrong? She was here, I stammered, pointing to the doors. She was right there. She said, I stopped myself. There was no way I could explain what I'd just seen, what I'd just heard. Kim frowned, her brow furrowed. Are you sure? Noelle, you've been through a lot tonight. Maybe... I'm not imagining things, I snapped, pulling away from her. She was here. Kim held up her hands in surrender. Okay, just sit down, all right? Take a minute. I sank back into my chair, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the desk. My mind raced, replaying the woman's words over and over. How did she know? No one knew about the baby. Not even Cal. I'd taken the tests a week ago, and I'd been planning to tell him Christmas morning. It was supposed to be a surprise, a joyful moment just for the two of us. But now, the thought of that moment was tainted by the woman's twisted words, her yellowed teeth, and her rotting breath. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:43 a.m. Christmas morning. Just a few more hours until the end of my shift. Just a few more hours to survive. I looked up, and my breath caught. Paul was standing in the lobby, staring out the glass doors into the storm. No, I whispered, rising from my seat. He began to walk, his movements slow and deliberate, his feet shuffling against the tile as though they weighed 1,000 pounds. Paul, I called, my voice shaky. Where are you going? You don't have to leave. Please don't go out there. He turned to look at me, tears streaming down his face. His eyes were full of sorrow and fear, but there was also a strange kind of resolve in them. I have to, he said softly. If I don't leave now, something horrible will happen to all of you. You've all been so kind to me. I can't let anything bad happen to anyone else because of me. He turned back to the doors and continued walking. Every instinct screamed at me to stop him, to pull him back inside. But some deeper, darker part of me knew he was right. The storm, the terror, the sheer wrongness of the night. It had all started with him. Paul reached the threshold and paused, adjusting his coat and trapper hat. Then, without looking back, he stepped into the storm and disappeared. The ER was silent. A few moments later, the main power flickered back on, bathing the room in harsh fluorescent light. I jumped at the sudden brightness, my nerves completely frayed. Paul was gone, swallowed by the storm, yet the weight of his warning lingered. His words played over and over in my head. If I don't leave now, something horrible will happen to all of you. What had he meant? What was waiting for us? I glanced at the clock. 4:10 a.m. The hours dragged by, each minute stretching endlessly. Kim and Rhonda moved through the ER quietly, tidying supplies and double-checking records as though this had been just another strange night. Maybe that was their way of coping, pretending it was normal. But for me, it wasn't normal. Nothing about this night would ever feel normal again. The storm had lessened, though it wasn't gone. Gusts of wind still rattled the windows, and snow clung to the glass in uneven clumps. But it was quieter now, a subdued stillness that was somehow worse than the storm's fury. By 7 a.m., the shift change finally arrived. Reinforcements trickled in, tired nurses bundled in scarves and coats, their boots squeaking against the wet tile. One of them, a nurse named Jenna, stopped at the station, eyeing my face. Rough night? You could say that, I replied, forcing a weak smile. Did something happen? Jenna pressed, her brow furrowed. You look like you've seen a ghost. Something like that, Rhonda muttered, brushing past her. I gave a brief, sanitized summary of the night, Paul's arrival, his odd behavior, and how he'd left. I left out the stranger. Talking about it felt dangerous, like speaking it aloud would summon her back. When I finally gathered my things and stepped outside, the cold hit me like a slap. The parking lot was blanketed in snow, the storm's fury now replaced by an oppressive stillness. The sky hung heavy with a dull gray, thick clouds smothering any hint of the sunrise. Even on what was meant to be the most joyful morning of the year, the world felt muted, as if it were holding its breath. I climbed into Cal's Sierra, the leather seat still frigid despite the heater's efforts. I started the truck, letting it rumble to life, and leaned back in the seat, closing my eyes. For the first time all night, I let myself breathe. I was about to shift into gear when something at the edge of the parking lot caught my eye. At first, it looked like a dark smudge against the pristine snow, barely noticeable beneath the low-hanging branches of a tree. But as I stared, a pit of dread settled in my stomach. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to drive away, to leave whatever it was behind. But I couldn't stop myself. Bundling my coat tighter around me, I stepped out of the truck and trudged toward the shape. My boots crunched loudly in the silence, the sound unnervingly sharp. When I got closer, my breath caught. It was Paul's trapper hat, half buried in the snow. A chill ran down my spine as I bent to pick it up. The moment my fingers brushed the brim, something heavy and wet slid out of it and landed in the snow with a sickening thud. I looked down. A scalp, blood-soaked, torn at the edges, and unmistakably human. A strangled cry escaped my throat, and I stumbled back, dropping the hat. My eyes darted to the tree nearby, where something slumped against the trunk. Paul, or what was left of him. His face was gone, the flesh torn away to reveal raw, jagged muscle. His chest cavity gaped open, his insides spilling out in a grotesque display. Blood stained the snow beneath him, vivid against the white. I turned and ran, bile rising in my throat as I sprinted back to the Sierra. The hospital staff acted quickly once I reported what I'd found. Police swarmed the parking lot, their lights flashing in harsh bursts against the dull gray sky. Yellow tape cordoned off the area as officers snapped photos and collected evidence. Kim, Rhonda, and I were questioned extensively, but none of us mentioned the stranger. None of us dared. Somehow we all understood that her existence, her presence, was better left unspoken. The officers informed us that the security footage had conveniently cut out 20 minutes after Paul first sat in the lobby, only to resume once the power was restored. Their skepticism was palpable, but they didn't push. When they finally let me go, I felt no relief, only exhaustion. By the time I pulled into the driveway of our little craftsman home, the sky had grown darker, the clouds thick and ominous. I climbed out of the truck, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my keys. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the only sound in the still morning air. As I reached the porch, a wave of dread washed over me. I froze, gripping the railing as my breath hitched. Slowly, I turned to look behind me. She was there, standing on the sidewalk in front of the house, her tall, thin frame perfectly still. Her black eyes glittered with cruel amusement, and her lips curled into that same twisted smile. My heart seized, and my knees nearly gave out. She tilted her head, her blonde hair falling across her gaunt face. "Noelle?" Cal's voice startled me, and I whipped around to see him standing in the doorway, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. I turned back toward the sidewalk, but she was gone. "Yeah," I said, my voice trembling. I forced a weak smile. "I'm fine, just tired." Cal studied me for a moment, then stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come on, let's get you inside." I nodded and followed him into the house, the warmth and familiarity of the living room doing little to calm my nerves. Cal brushed snow off my shoulders, glancing at me. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," I repeated, forcing more conviction into my voice. "Just a long night." He didn't press further, and I was grateful. I wanted to tell him everything, to pour out the events of the night and let him make sense of it. But I couldn't. Talking about it would make it real in a way I wasn't ready to face. The rest of Christmas unfolded in a peaceful stillness. Cal and I exchanged gifts by the softly glowing tree, sipped rich hot cocoa, and watched Christmas movies as snow drifted lazily outside the window. When the moment felt right, I finally shared the joyful news about the newest addition to our family. Cal's face lit up with pure delight, and we spent the remainder of the day wrapped in excitement, talking and dreaming about our future with the baby's arrival. But every so often, I caught myself glancing at the window, expecting to see her face staring back at me. The fact that she had followed me here, that she had chosen to show herself outside my home, meant something. Something not good. As night fell, I sat by the window, staring out into the darkened street. The snow was still, the world quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning.